During his first time going to prison for a drug-related offense, William Mahoney couldn't have foreseen just how much it would change him. It was only after this conviction that William joined a locally prominent gang and became a repeat offender of more serious crimes, including illegal arms possession and assault. His first time going to prison, it was assumed it would change him for the better, but it only bred a more dangerous man. Instead of getting the help he needed to reform his life, William was exploited as a laborer and severely neglected. He was even stabbed 30 times while guards watched and spent 10 days in an ICU. Prison didn't reform his life. It devalued it. Now, most people understand why we have prisons. It can be broken down into two purposes. Prison is meant to reform inmates or to make society safer by keeping the most dangerous members of society from the public. In William's case, it did neither. But it did make a profit. In practice, it seems there's a different reality to prisons and rehabilitation. And to a lot of people, the difference between a prison and business is nothing at all. In fact, private prisons are backed and operated by companies like Microsoft, AT&T, IBM, Boeing, and Dell, and use the prison population as a low-cost workforce to make their products. These prisons are notorious for having far lower quality than public prisons and for facing numerous lawsuits from former inmates, including Mahoney, who often say their rights were egregiously violated. Over 100,000 people are currently being exploited and abused, and our system is enforcing it. So it's time we take it upon ourselves to address this issue by discussing the causes, effects, and solutions to private prisons. So first of all, in understanding this issue better, we need to understand what's fueling the sudden increase in private prisons. They're highly profitable, and the prison population is stigmatized. In the 1980s, a burgeoning prison population resulting from the war on drugs and increased use of incarceration caused prison overcrowding and rising costs to become increasingly problematic for local, state, and federal governments. Private businesses, of course, saw an opportunity. As a result, private sector involvement moved from simple contracting of services like laundry or custodial work to full-scale management. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, there are over 100 private prisons today, with 133,000 inmates behind their bars, and that number is expected to grow within the next decade to 360,000 inmates. For those investing in the private prison industry, it's a goldmine of cheap labor to make their products. However, it may not be very surprising to know that for-profit prisons were invented to make a profit. After all, it's in the title. But it's important to understand just how large that profit margin is. The St. Louis American of August 28, 2013 reports that this business generates over $72 billion a year in profit, all on the backs of the incarcerated, and your tax dollars paying for their contracts. You would think thousands of people being exploited for cheap labor right here on our own borders would draw a lot more attention from the public. But unlike most similar cases, there simply aren't that many people who care about the incarcerated. Largely, this can be chalked up to a stigma against convicts, one that is perpetuated by even the very people appointed to represent them. For example, no politician runs on being soft on crime. Historically, it's been important for political figures to treat criminals as the enemy in the interest of public safety. It's this kind of prejudice that bleeds over into our everyday lives and paints a villainizing picture of those who have done time as dangerous, despite the fact the American Civil Liberties Union reports that 79% of the incarcerated are imprisoned for non-violent crimes. Furthermore, as the Washington Post of February 25, 2014 notes, an apathy towards the welfare of the incarcerated has led the government to be anything but encouraging to rigorous comparisons between public and private prisons. So even if the public wanted to know more about private prisons and their cost or their actual quality, there isn't much real data out there. Now, in understanding profitability and the prison population's stigma, we need to understand how they're impactful by looking at their effects, incentivizing corrections, and increasing income inequality. But first, incentivizing corrections. When investors are involved in the political process, it invariably puts their interests on the map. Lobbyists abound on Capitol Hill, working to protect the interests of those investors and big businesses. But what happens when one of those big businesses is prison? Well, their profit comes from incarceration. So the ultimate goal of lobbying in this case is to keep prisons full. This is why 65% of private prisons have prison bed occupancy guarantee clauses, most of which guarantee they remain 90% full at any given time. And why the Washington Post of September 19, 2013 argues that government contracts with private prisons create longer prison sentences. We also have to consider that as a business gets bigger, its workforce needs to grow. For private prisons, that means that not only does incarceration have to remain stable, but it has to increase in order to maximize profit. As any business strives to do, private prisons aim to expand. But if you never break the law, then sure, incentivizing corrections may not seem like a problem to you. But you should be concerned, because it doesn't just affect those who are incarcerated. It also increases income inequality in the U.S. The National Employment Law Project estimates that about 30% of all working-age adults have criminal records. That number is important because due to the stigma those with criminal records face, most of those people will have a very difficult time finding a job. And NYU Law estimates that the employment rate of those with convictions is between 45 and 60%, meaning about half of all former convicts are unemployed. In fact, Bill Moyers of August 22, 2014 argues that one reason for the aforementioned government apathy towards the incarcerated is that statistically, they contribute significantly less to the economy after they're released. We can't sit idly by and allow our poorest citizens to become resources to make the rich richer. We have to do something, and the solutions range from the national level to the community. On the national level, the government needs to ban private prisons. All the problems mentioned thus far are symptoms, but business getting involved with corrections is the issue itself. You can't regulate those problems away because a business will never have a reason to rehabilitate prisoners and reintroduce them to society. It's simply not in their best interest when their profit comes from keeping prisons full. And here's how we end them. The government should work to decriminalize drug offenses, much like the state of California did via referendum when it passed Proposition 47, decriminalizing marijuana offenses and reinvesting prison funds into drug treatment. This would not only help to combat the growing problem of prison overcrowding, but would also help our criminal justice system better serve the purpose of rehabilitation rather than simple conviction. If both these things are done, 538 of November 26, 2014 suggests it would counterbalance the rising costs of prison due to the drug war. In short, decriminalization would allow the government to close private prisons because it wouldn't need them to cover the costs. On the community level, we have to end the stigma against former inmates. It doesn't make sense to advocate for social justice issues if we ignore those affected by systemic oppression the most. As I've mentioned before, prison is a recurring cycle that unfortunately recurs because the stigma against those with convictions makes it immensely difficult to reenter society or to provide for your family. If that stigma were gone, maybe the cycle can be broken. And there are lots of ways to do this. If you're a business owner or ever plan on becoming one, I strongly encourage you to join the Ban the Box movement, in which employers remove the question on criminal offenses from their application process. And as an individual, it's really quite simple. Just don't perpetuate the stigma. You can even become an advocate, because many no longer have the right to vote. But if you still do, you can effectively be a voice for those without one. So today, we've seen the causes, effects, and solutions to private prisons and their exploitation of the incarcerated. Regardless of what mistakes these people may have made, in the end, they're still people. And it's our job, not just as speakers or as leaders, but as human beings, to defend every oppressed group, even criminals. Lives are not a capital resource. They're unique and invaluable, and more often than not, they're imperfect. Like William Mahoney, whose life, if reformed and not exploited, could be so much more.